Welcome back to The Move, where we are vibing with the book at least 10 minutes at a time.
Next 10 minutes, we're looking at Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 to 22.
Have you read this passage and thought to yourself, what is going on with this idea of a will? Verse
100%.
16.
And what this reminds me a lot of is all the way back to season chapter 1.
Okay.
Season chapter 1. Season 1.
Season chapter 1, verse 87.
When we were looking through Romans 7 and we're just reading through it and we're like, this feels like a deviation. This feels like a detour. Why in the world is all of a sudden Paul talking about, married to one man, now married to another man? It just seemed very bizarre. And then it halfway through the episode,
Then it landed.
Oh!
Yeah.
I am anticipating some sort of this because it does feel like it's where are you going with this?
Oh, does it for you?
A little bit.
Tell me where.
Well, just the idea, the idea of a will, there's obviously the death, there's sacrifices that are taking place, but the idea of a will seems to be kind of like a new introduction to the chapter.
Okay. So this is a linguistic problem or a translation problem, maybe, because the word for covenant and the word for will are the same, diatheke. In the Greek. I think that sometimes the translators make decisions that try to make sense of the text.
Sure.
But I think what is best happening here is that when the text transitions to talking about a will, like verse 15 and then the 16, right? Mm-hmm. For where there is a will involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. Well, this is actually diatheke, covenant, but it's probably best understood as broken will or broken covenant, right? Okay. So when there is a covenant involved, and particularly a broken covenant, the death of the one who made it must be established. And if I remember right, the Greek there is anaphero, I believe, which it must be born, it must be executed, it must be carried, it must be
So it's not saying that you have to prove that the person who's dead is dead. It's saying that because the covenant is broken, you actually got to go and seek the life of the person who broke the covenant?
Well, so again, you and I have a contract, right? Mm-hmm. And what is the power of the contract? The power of the contract is the authority behind it. And if the authority doesn't execute the stipulations of the contract, how good is that contract?
So if there is no punishment for a broken contract, then the contract is in itself pointless.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Particularly, I would punishment, yes, and punishment not in the sense of... It's always consequential, yeah? Because say you and I have a contract and you and I end up, one of us deviates from the contract. When you say punishment, what is it that you're expecting to get from the consequences of the contract that, quote unquote, punish?
Well, what am I expecting?
Yeah.
Whatever the stipulations of the contract was. If the contract is broken, then fill in the blank. So whatever the fill in the blank is, maybe it's not a punishment as just the cause and effect of a broken contract.
Well, you'd probably be looking for some restitution.
Sure.
Right? Some sort of minimal restitution that at least guarantees that you don't lose your shirt, right? In the whatever contract we have. So it might be a financial contract and say, I actually back out of it and you've already given resources to this. So you and I sign a 3-month contract. You're going to do all this production work, right? And just before we start, I say, nah, I can't. But then the contract stipulates that I have to give you 20% of the agreed upon price or 35%. And if I don't actually give you the 35%, then how good is the contract?
Yeah, no good. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So then you'll have an authority figure that actually imposes the requirement of the contract, right? Okay. But that's only kicks in if the contract itself is broken, because the contract is for you to do 3 months of production and me to pay you whatever sum, right?
Sure.
If the contract is broken, there's a stipulation there that requires, hey, this is what's actually going to happen if this contract is broken.
Got it.
Right? So the theme of Hebrews thus far is that there is a first contract, and that contract is between God and the people. Now, the fault does not lie with the stipulations of the contract, as it were. The fault lies with those who made the contract because they can't actually keep the stipulations of the contract, right?
Okay. So because they couldn't hold up to their end of the bargain, then they are subject to the consequences of the contract, which in this case would be death.
Yeah, that's right. Right? Because all of the words that God said we will do, right? This is Abraham in Genesis 15 going through the blood walk, right? Where actually textually Abraham doesn't go through.
Yeah.
It's God and these two lights that he sees, right? Indicating something, right? It's prophetically indicating something that God makes a contract with Abraham, and then Abraham doesn't actually participate in walking through. Why? Because the contract that God makes with Abraham is on the integrity of God's own life, not Abraham's.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing is true about the contract that's made with Israel, right? It's based on God's own life, but it's based on God's own life if Israel receives the promise in the way that Abraham received the promise. So Abraham received the promise and walked by faith, right? He walked in obedience to the promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Israel does not actually receive the promise. This is what Hebrews has told us. They did not posture their hearts in agreement by faith. Hebrews chapter 3, right? So that they were disobedient, right? So that then because of disobedience, what is the consequence? Many of them died in the wilderness. That generation died in the wilderness. This is what's going on in Hebrews chapter 9, is that there is a broken covenant, and the consequences of that broken covenant must actually be borne. They must be carried. They must be, like ESV says, they must be established, right? Verse 17, for a broken covenant, diatheke, takes effect only at death, since it is not enforced as long as the ones who made it is alive. So as long as you and I are keeping the contract, it doesn't need to be enforced in this way, right? And then here's an allusion back to the first contract. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled the book itself and the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, right? So that the stipulations of the contract, as it seems, are ratified in blood. That is
Weird thing.
That's
Peculiar, at least different to us.
right. And why is it ratified in blood? The text tells us that the life is in the blood. So that the covenant is seemingly saying, hey, to keep it is to live. Right? But to break it
Requires death.
is to die.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that under the law, this is actually indicated, right? That when Moses actually sprinkles everything with blood, it's very symbolic. Life and death. Right here. Right?
Keep it as life. If you don't,
Right? There's consequences. You keep it as death. And so without the shedding of blood, there's this.
me?
Is it you?
I don't know if that's me or that's you. I think that might be me. That's my bad, y'all. Sorry. If you're listening to the movie and you're like, yeah, am I getting text messages? No, you're not.
That was Justin.
That was me. My bad.
Yeah, so it's really important just to establish that this first part, and it's going to go into in the next part in verse 23, is that there is a broken covenant, and this broken covenant has a consequence. Without that consequence being executed, it doesn't actually have teeth. So that consequence actually occurs, and then the author gives this call back like, look, everything under the law is consecrated with blood, and blood, we know, life and death. And so under the law, there is an indicator about how severe this contract is, right? And so that the death of one must be established. And it's a bit of a cliffhanger because
who's going to die?
Exactly. The resolution actually comes in verse 23.
Oh, okay. So that's where we'll get in the next one.
Okay?